Hi, Brian here with another video on my web application NetChecklistcom. So NetChecklistcom is a really great tool for managing and implementing business processes, but even I don't use it to manage every process in the businesses that I own. While there are definitely times when using the application will be extremely helpful and it makes sense to use it, there are also times when using it would probably just slow you down. In this video, I'm going to talk about the factors that influence whether or not it's going to make sense for you to use the application for a given process. These factors are definitely interrelated, so even if one factor seemed to indicate that it would or would not make sense to use the application for that process, there could easily be other factors that outweigh that, and that's what we're going to talk about in this video. So the simplest way to sum it up is to say that it all comes down to complexity and timing. Let's talk about complexity first. It's obviously going to make sense to use the application for more complex processes, and it's not going to make sense to use it for less complex processes, but that's pretty general. So let's talk about what makes a process more or less complex. The first factor that influences the complexity of a process is the number of different steps or individual tasks that make up that process. Obviously, the more steps there are in a process, the more difficult it's going to be for someone to remember to do every single one of them every single time, and the more likely it will be that using an application to help manage that process will be beneficial. But like I said, however, there are other important factors that influence that, so it may still make perfect sense to use the application for a process that only requires a few steps to complete. The next factor that influences the complexity of a process is the number of different people who are responsible for completing the individual tasks that make up that process. If only one person is responsible for completing all of the tasks on a given process, then they may do just fine working off of a paper checklist that's stuck in their desk drawer. But paper checklists are very difficult to share among different people unless they work in close proximity to each other, where they can physically look at the piece of paper that a checklist is printed on together. Because of the way this application assigns the different tasks from a checklist to the different members of your organization, it makes it possible for each person who is assigned tasks from the checklist to see and check off the tasks assigned to them, no matter where they are physically located, while still keeping up with the progress on the overall process. And this is going to become an even more important factor when we include the next factor that we're going to talk about. And that is the number of task dependencies among the tasks in the process. So task dependencies are when one task can't be completed until another task or tasks have first been completed. Obviously, the more dependencies there are in a process, the more complex the process becomes. Now, this is a pretty major factor because of the fact that the NetChecklist.com application is so incredibly helpful in managing task dependencies for you. When you're trying to deal with task dependencies manually, it's not that difficult if you only have a few. But when you have many, even if you have a complete list of all the tasks that a certain task is dependent on, as you're going through the process, every time you get to that dependent task, you have to stop and take the time to manually check to see if all of the tasks that one is dependent on have been completed. And you may end up having to do that several times before you find that they have finally all been completed, and you can go ahead and complete the task in question. This is very cumbersome to do manually, but NetChecklist.com completely automates that for you. The task dependencies become an even bigger factor when the different members of your organization are assigned to the dependent tasks and the tasks that they're dependent on. Remember, in the application, it makes no difference who these different tasks are assigned to. So a dependent task assigned to one member of your team won't show up on their task list until all of the tasks it's dependent on have been marked complete, even if each of those other tasks were all assigned to different members of the team. And when that dependent task does finally show up on their task list, the person that it's assigned to will know that all of the tasks it's dependent on have been marked complete by whoever they were assigned to. So this actually becomes a form of communication between your team members. And these people never have to sit down together to go over their progress on a checklist that's printed on a piece of paper. and your processes also move along much more quickly. And this is one of the 8 important ways that the application helps teams work together more effectively and efficiently. So, but what we're talking about here is whether or not it's going to make sense to use the application to manage a given process. The more task dependencies that exist in that process, and the more of those different tasks that are assigned to different members of the team, then the more it's going to make sense to use the application to help you manage that process. The last factor that influences the complexity of a process is whether or not it includes any checklist branches. And if you recall from the introduction video, checklist branches are where the application can selectively add additional tasks to the task list for you as you're going through a process based on things you learn and questions your team answer along the way. Now, it wouldn't take more than 1 or 2 checklist branches to make the application highly beneficial to use for a given process. So those are the factors that influence the complexity of a process. Let's talk about timing. Okay, the first factor related to timing that influences whether or not it's going to make sense to use the application for a given process is the length of the time period over which it generally takes to complete the process. If you're working with a process that can be completed in the time span of a few minutes or hours, or maybe even over a couple of work days, start to finish, then it's not going to be too terribly difficult to remember exactly what you have and haven't done on that process. But if completing a process normally spans a period of days or weeks or months, then it becomes far more difficult for someone to remember exactly where they left off in that process. And even if someone seems to be managing the process somewhat effectively, if every time they go back to work on that process, they have to spend a few minutes just trying to figure out where they left off and checking to see what they have and haven't done, then they're constantly wasting time doing that, and they're really not managing it as effectively as they could be. Another factor related to processes that typically span a period of days, weeks, or months is whether or not the process includes any delayed tasks. The delayed tasks feature of the application is for when the completion of certain tasks needs to be deliberately delayed, such as following up with a sales prospect a week or so after initial contact. It's very difficult for someone to remember that they need to complete these types of tasks after a few days or a week or a month goes by, and reminders are very, very helpful. So you could design a process where each of your salespeople had a different set of materials that they shared with each of their prospects each week. So you had certain materials for each one, for week 1, different materials for week 2, different materials for week 3. And the application could very easily help them keep on track with where they are in the process with each of their different prospects, even though you'd have different prospects at all different points along the way. A final factor related to processes that typically span a period of days, weeks, or months is the checklist dates feature of the application, whether the process includes any checklist dates. If you remember from the introduction video, I used the example of the scheduled closing date for a real estate transaction, where a user would be prompted to enter the scheduled closing date for a transaction when they're copying the checklist, and the application can then assign any of the tasks from the checklist based on whatever scheduled closing date the user enters. Whenever you have a process where any of the individual tasks need to be completed on some predetermined date, then it's going to be highly likely that the application will be able to help you complete that process more efficiently because of that feature. So the next factor related to timing is the number of instances of that process that you and your team generally have going on at one time. So use an example, if you're building houses and you never build more than one at a time, start to finish, then it's not too terribly difficult to keep up with everything that you need to do. But if you typically have 5 or 10 or 20 houses under construction at one time, then you're in a whole different ballgame. And it gets really hard to remember what you have and haven't done for each house. And so even if you remember to order the windows and doors for 3 houses last week, what if you really needed to have ordered them for 5? And how often would you worry that you'd forgotten to order the windows and doors for a house and take the time to call your supplier only to find out that yes, in fact, you had already ordered them for that house, and that's a waste of time. People often don't realize that an important benefit of using checklists is that in addition to reminding you of what you need to do, they also remind you of what you've already done. So, the third factor related to timing is how often that process gets done. The more often someone does something, the easier it is for them to remember how to do it. But if someone only does something once or twice a year, then it can be pretty hard to remember all of the necessary steps in that process, even if there really aren't that many of them, or if there's not that much other complexity in the process. So the final factor related to timing involves processes that need to be done over and over again on some regular time interval. The recurring checklists feature of this application makes using it for these types of processes highly beneficial, and that's because it can automatically copy checklists for you at whatever time interval you specify. So it not only helps you and your team remember all of the necessary steps to complete the process, it also reminds you when it's time to complete them again. And once you have your checklist recurrences set up for your organization and the application starts copying the checklists for you, the tasks that everyone needs to complete are just going to show up on their task list whenever it's time for them to be completed again. And so because of this, whenever a process needs to be completed on some regular recurring interval, it's probably going to make sense to use the application for that process, even if it's a fairly simple one. Lastly, keep in mind that the application can help you and your team work together, work more efficiently, and work together more efficiently, both individually and together, in at least 8 different ways. So you may benefit from using the application for a given process, even if it still may be questionable based on the factors that we've discussed here. To learn more, there are lots of training videos on YouTube. Go to www.youtube.com/c/NetChecklist, or just do a search for NetChecklist, all one word. There are 2 playlists set up on YouTube. A playlist is a series of videos that can take you through them in order. For standard users who don't need to know how to set up checklists, see the playlist called NetChecklist Training Series for Standard Users. And for those who need to be able to set up checklists to manage users and do other more advanced features, see the playlist called NetChecklist Training Series for Administrators. So that's the factors that influence whether or not you should use the application for a given process. Thanks for watching.